I'm doing this on my own today. There's no squirrel to keep me on track. There is no Cathy telling me what we're going to talk about. And I do already miss the back and forth discussion that leads up to the eventual start of the recording. And so, from that standpoint, I have sort of an announcement and a bit of a discussion around it. And I think that will make up a pretty good episode, I guess, for Sunday mornings with Jaime and Cathy. But I noticed something in my work at school, and it's one of those kind of noticings that I would file in gestalt ripening. And by that, I mean, as an IEP case manager, as a special educator, I have access to longitudinal data. And, if you've been following my writings and stuff, that, in my railings against the naysayers and whatnot, we talk about how they never really wanted to see the longitudinal data that Marge Blanc has in her work. And from the standpoint of me as case manager, I have access to my students' longitudinal data. Now, I'm not going to violate their privacy by telling you all these wonderful details are in there or not. But I did, something has been kind of bugging me about one particular aspect. And now I have enough data and I've seen enough. And so now it's kind of ripening into something, but there's a pattern I noticed. And the pattern is that a great many students with IEPs, right, in California, we have what's called transitional kindergarten. And so younglings can enter into the school system almost like 2 or 3 years old. And then from that standpoint, some of them get labeled, get assessed for an IEP, and their eligibility for services is under developmental delay. And so we see that over the next year or so, they might, start moving about the room a little bit more. They might respond to teachers and carers a little bit differently, but their behaviors are still a bit off. Social reciprocity is a bit off. Response to command is off, and so on. So they get reevaluated. And they're found to be eligible under autism. And that sticks with them usually around kindergarten time. So between 2 and 5, generally, they're thought of as developmentally delayed. And then from 5 to 6, 7 or point, that kindergarten to year 2, they're autistic. But then something happens, especially in girls. And that is, they make a friend. They start to chat to people. And of course, we know that autistic people don't make friends and they cannot chat to people. But when that happens, the system responds on their next triennial reevaluation to say, well, wait a minute, if you're chatting to people, if you have a friend, if you're not having these kind of aggressive behaviors, then you cannot be autistic. And therefore, because you have these existing kind of learning struggles with language, we're going to call that specific learning disability. And that eligibility for IEP services stays there from that standpoint all the way until they graduate from high school, almost 100% of the time. And so I started seeing a lot of this, especially, again, with females, where I would meet them in high school and the pattern of their data is fairly set at that point. And I see a basic plateau of growth in mathematics and language that, they're in year 8, year 9, but their data says, academically they're performing, independently at year 3, year 4, year 5. And so it's thought that they have a specific learning disability. And then I chat to them, I meet them, I talk to family, I have my decoder ring, right? And I find a great deal of them to be gestalt processors. And so I have this week off and, I've been collecting notes on things for a while now and just kind of writing some scripts down for myself and processing this. But I thought to myself, what would happen if there's something different going on, right? How might we read this, right? So delay is not a neutral term, right? Delay is not a neutral term. Developmental delay sounds objective, but it's actually very theory laden. And if you look at the assessment instruments that we use in special education and in disability services, right, delay is often presented as neutral, but it really depends upon what the adults in the child's life expect development to look like. And so that depends on what sequence they assume is normal, right? And I think you can probably predict where this is going. Um, so from that standpoint, what outward behaviors do they count as evidence? And so from that standpoint, I wrote another paper. I know it's crazy, but I have the week off, and so um, I wanted to do something with that information, and a very um, a very interesting invitation came across my desk, right? And I suspect it's because I published the GLP paper, and then I don't know this for sure, but I think Sage says, "Oh, here's the contact information of these new people in our system," and other publishers and other journals say, "Oh, okay, fine. Maybe we'll spam them, and maybe we can get a paper out of them, or whatever." And so I found in my spam bin an invitation to contribute to a journal of developmental psychology. And I had no idea really what that was, but what I found is that these are the people that create these assessment instruments. And so what would somebody who is the consumer of these things, have to say about somebody, or say to somebody who's the producer of these things? Well, I thought to myself, what if this delay that we are looking at is not delay at all, but a category error? What if the validity of the instrument is not there because they're looking at the wrong thing, right? And so around that, I I wrote a paper. And so I don't know how it's going to be received. I don't know what exactly they are going to do with it. But I published it, they accepted it. Um, and so from that standpoint, I'm pretty excited. Um, I want to walk through that whole kind of process with you, because I think it's a good place to start, if you will. Um, so I'm kind of freestyling it here without the emotional support human of Cathy, but um, from that standpoint, I want to really, really, really touch on why I think this is important, right? When delay is a category error, right? If autistic language, if we accept the premise that I made, talking about the field notes that the DSM's instrument base creates for us in assessing gestalt processors, right? We can read the behaviors they describe in our own language and say, oh, that's really good at describing gestalt processing. So what if, by extension, that language is being misread by psychologists, psychiatrists, school-based assessments, and so on? If it's being misread by the framework, then what do we do about it? And so, again, I wrote a paper, right? And so that phrase again, developmental delay, what is it? What if it's no delay at all? What if it's an entirely different cognition? Well, I think, again, you know the answer to that question. And so, um, from the standpoint of the assessment instruments, on the standpoint of the philosophy behind them, delay is not merely observed, it's inferred against assumptions about sequence and timing and what counts as evidence of development, valid evidence, right? And so from that standpoint, it's not neutral, right? Parents are expecting certain things to happen at certain times because doctors and schools have told them. And when that doesn't happen, then they get the assessment, right? But again, that's not neutral. It depends on assumptions, and those assumptions are entirely analytic. And so, from that standpoint, adults are assuming language moves from part to whole. The assessment instruments assume that language moves from part to whole. They assume that you start with isolated words and then you build structures around them. Johnny and see and run becomes see, Johnny, run. They expect kind of that flexible generation of speech, that you decontextualize the performance of it, and that's what real skill looks like. And so if the model that they're using in the assessments assumes that the parts must come first, then a child who begins with holes will always look late, right? And we see this. And so what do we do with that information, right? And so for me, I thought, I'll take the opportunity to write 8,000 words and submit it to a journal. And my hope is that in doing so, they actually accept it. I don't know if they will or not. I was kind of suspicious of the inquiry to begin with. And so I responded back to the solicitation to say that I'm a poor school teacher and, I have affiliation with a non-profit autism support organization. I don't have a lot of money. I don't mind contributing, but I can't pay any kind of processing fees or whatever. And I half expected that to be that. And to my surprise, a very nice lady replied back to me that they're more than happy to not charge me any submission fees. So with that, I gathered all of my notes and put together a paper and submitted it the other day and, received the acceptance back and all of that kind of stuff. So we'll see. We will see if something happens out of that. But I wanted to kind of walk you through a bit of the structure. I'm not going to read 22 pages to you, but we can look at the profile of the person who shows up first as developmentally delayed, and then as autistic, and then as learning disabled, right? And we can say from the standpoint of we gestalt processors, we store scripts, larger utterances, we store atmospheres, we store weather, right? And I know from my children, from myself, that oftentimes how I retrieve a gestalt and the words that I need to mitigate in there, sometimes the pronunciation is a little bit different because the source is different, and all of these kinds of things that can look like delay and that can look like difference, right? And I know from myself how echolalia works. I know how I use Substack as kind of a delayed echolalia where I park my scripts, right? And that sometimes the answer that I need, the GLP conference, I had written a whole bunch of stuff prior to the invitation, but in the receiving of the 7 questions, the famous 7 questions now, I ended up writing 20,000 more words around it, but I was gathering things that I had stored on Substack. And that's kind of a delayed segmentation, right? So am I developmentally delayed for doing that? Well, of course not, right? I just have a different processing architecture. And from the standpoint of these assessment instruments, they don't recognize that as valid, right? They don't recognize those kind of strong contextual or affective anchorings. They think it's quirky, different, whatever. But it's evidence that, I want you to answer, Jaime, I want you to answer this question, maybe take 3 words. What's your favorite color? I love this question. What's your favorite color? And it usually takes me a little bit of time to kind of settle into that. Okay, is this somebody who wants one word? Is this somebody who wants me to give them the word and then the explanation of the word because I know they do not know this word? And then how much explanation do they really want? When will they tune out? Will I seem weird in doing it? Right? All of these internal monologues that happen. But one of my colleagues in school, he has a thing where he's differentiating on the whiteboard with different colors, and he will, he'll ask a question of a student, you know, trig ratios or whatever at the moment. He'll say, "What's your favorite color?" And he's holding his dry erase markers, and they might say red or green or whatever, and so that's what he'll use to do something. And so every once in a while, he'll ask me, "Hey, Doctor H, what's your favorite color?" And so that thought process immediately, very autistic of me, very gestalt of me, will start. Okay, so I know what my favorite color is. It's cerulean. The first time I said it to him, it was kind of just stopped, right? Because in his hand, he doesn't have a cerulean pen. And so he says, "Well, what's that?" says he. And I said, "Well, it's kind of the color of dusk. The sun's down already. And in between the orangeness of the sunset and the blackness of the night sky, there is this hue that is just gorgeous." And I wanted to, and he's like, "Okay, stop, 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 stop. No, it's blue. Okay." You just had to say blue. And I said, "But blue is not my favorite color. Cerulean is, right?" And so these affective anchoring, this context is absolutely vital to my answering of the question. But the system would register that as delay because I cannot come to just blue. Um, and so from that standpoint, the answer to my question, the answer to that question kind of seems uneven, right? It's kind of asynchronous. I have to do all of these calculations before I come out and say it. And so now, within that context, if he ever asks me again, I can kind of wink and say, "Well, you know what the answer is, but since you don't have that color, then I will say blue." Right. And that's how that's going to work. Right. But from the standpoint of that testing environment, the panic, "What's your favorite color, Jamie?" "Oh, crap." Right. So I have to hang on for a second. And that answer should come very quickly, right? And kind of the nails are a version of cerulean. I just wanted to kind of illustrate the point. But how are adults who are expecting a very simple question to receive a very simple answer, how are they scoring this, right? Does it make me look competent or incompetent? And so how does that get misread, right? How does a child who uses scripts, who cannot mitigate yet, who cannot sort, who cannot break things down and rearrange on stuff, how is that being read by the testing instrument, right? How would a child be read if they answered it in an entirely different way, indirectly, right? To them, it's perfectly coherent. Or perhaps they have invented a word that makes perfect sense to them, and the person who is assessing them has no idea what they're talking about. And I know I saw this with my daughter, how a lot of her words made perfect sense in her head, but they were not English. They were not any particular language at all. Um, they were kind of a mashup of sounds and stuff that she heard in relation to something, and it made perfect sense to her. And every once in a while, there was a bit of a comedy when the word actually exists in a language, in one particular case, Spanish. And there was this kind of misunderstanding where somebody is hearing her say this word and they're inferring meaning, and then she's looking at them confused because what they're replaying back to her has nothing to do with what she's on about. And how is that tested, right? How is it tested when a child kind of repeats things until you get it, right? "I've said it. I've said it. I've said it. Well, can you explain?" And I just repeat the lines, right? How is it assessed when a child can understand more than they can, more than they can show on demand, right? And when a child's language is more available in safety than under testing, right? And that's for me a big issue. So I always insist that students come and test with me, the quiet of my room, not in the big library, not in the like administrative offices where there's all this kind of power and pressure and stuff, right? And so we do testing in safety, right? Have a seat. Would you like a drink? Bit of candy? Do you want to fidget? How you doing today? Let's have a talk. Let's have a chat. Check in. How's the family? All of these kinds of things to lower that filter on them and get them in a place where we can have a better chance of finding out what they can and cannot do. And so from that standpoint, the things that I'm hearing, with teenagers, they're already fairly meaningful, but they might not be easily or instantly segmentable. And I see this in the Wilcock-Johnson in the word attack. And that's one of my kind of go-to tests if I suspect somebody is, a gestalt processor who's kind of stuck in that development. But the word attack is all nonsense words. They're designed to mirror the conventions of standard American English, but they are not something that a student would have access to in their sight word repertoire. So I've noticed a lot of older Gestalt processors have a fairly okay 1 to 4,000 word sight word vocabulary memorized, where they can read something and they can produce speech from these words. But if they encounter a word they've never seen before, they don't do phonics, they don't try to break it down, they don't do the letters and the sounds and stuff. Sometimes they have a giggle, sometimes they panic, sometimes they freeze, but that response is very meaningful to me. And so we might pause there and say, you know, tell me what happened. Tell me what you're feeling inside when you encounter that particular letter combination, right? And so that gives me a chance to kind of diagnose through conversation around what is it about that they're not doing. And so I can give them basic reading inventory, and a lot of that are the sight words that they're used to. And so they see it, they see the pattern, and they cue the utterance. And at a certain point, you get into words that come to English from French, milieu, repertoire, these kinds of things, where they don't necessarily intersect with my students, in the neighborhood and in the cultures that they're in. And so they don't have a knowledge of French then, and so they don't know how to sound it out. And so that kind of serves in the same way as the word attack, where I don't think milieu and repertoire are going to be in their sight word vocabulary. And so I want to feel and see how they navigate their way through that. So from an analytic model, all of these things can look like delay. From a Gestalt model, it's a different organization, right? So from the standpoint of Gestalt organized development, and part of the reason why I wrote the books and stuff, is what do these milestones look like? How do they remain internally coherent when understood and developed on their own terms, right? And so from that standpoint, I am writing to the people who create these assessments, right? What does it mean when you have this clinical interpretation that privileges decontextualized performance? Rapid retrieval, novel output, segmented speech, externally imposed prompts, right? And so we can look at the different types of things that at different ages they're exposed to. Here's a picture and 3 words, write a sentence. What if I can't? What if it takes me a while? What if the thing that I end up writing is different than what you're expecting, right? And so even these kinds of hierarchies of the evidence, they are themselves analytic. They're not universal to humanity. And so too much of my field and too much of a lot of therapies around autism and gestalt processing, language processing, they still mistake performance under pressure for baseline capacity, right? And so I say that as I feel it right now because I don't have Cathy with me, right? To kind of bounce in and, make sure I'm not straying too far from the topic and ask counter questions and stuff. So this performance under pressure, not something I normally do, what is it saying about my baseline capacity? And at my age, if I'm struggling to do this, what about a youngling? How's that going to work, right? And so too much of the field assumes that if a child can do it, that stripped down task, then the capacity is not there, right? They're delayed developmentally. And so we know as Gestalt processors, people that work with Gestalt and support Gestalt processors, that a child can be meaning rich long before they're test friendly. And so from that standpoint, the question really isn't, what can a child do and say right now on command? The question really is, what forms of organized meaning are already present and what conditions make them visible, right? The safety needs. And so from that standpoint, it matters not only clinically, but ethically, right? And so in my paper, I explicitly link the PTMF, the Power Threat Meaning Framework, that categories like delay, they don't just describe, they shape what's noticed, what they value, and what they're targeting for correction. Once a child is named as delayed, the system often acts as if the interpretive question has already been settled. And so from this standpoint, it's not, it's a structural problem. And so once this misclassification happens, the child is acted upon through remediation. The scripts are treated as noise. The actual meaning is interrupted. They learn that their real, authentic language doesn't account. And so the danger here is not that we just misunderstand the child. It's the danger that we teach the child that their way of meaning is illegible unless, and unintelligible unless it imitates ours. Right? That's devastating to a child. And so I offer in the paper, what we should do differently, right? I want to give them, I don't just want to tell them, oh, you're crap, go home. I want to give them a way out, right? And so from the implications that I put in the paper, right, I ask them, can we treat delay as hypothesis, not as verdict? Can we widen what we count as evidence? And then can we observe longitudinally, not just take these little snapshots? Right? Can we include context? Can we include relationship? Can we include safety? Can we include co-regulation? Right? If a child co-regulates with a stuffed toy, a fidget, a human being, are they present in the room? What happens in the testing environment when those things are not possible? And so, can we stop treating echolalia as automatically less meaningful? Can we work with stored gestalts rather than against them? Can we ask what the language is doing, not whether it's just novel, right? And can we stop forcing the child into the only sequence that the system understands or rewards, right? And so I think that's a lot to ask. I don't know how the paper is going to land, if it will pass through the peer review and editorial and into publication, but I think that's the next logical step for me in my journal papers, is that I think we've said, between those of us that have published on the Gestalt side since Peters and Prezant, that Gestalt exists, that echolalia is functional and incredibly meaningful. It's time to start kind of pushing back at the system and saying, hey, right, if developmental architecture is being measured, right, by tools that don't match the architecture, then the diagnosis is telling us more about the framework than the child, right? Thus the category error part of the title. And so, coming back to myself as practitioner, but as also kind of member of the community, when we hear the word delay, I think we need to kind of pause. There may be real delay there, and supports and the needs around supports may be very real, but sometimes what's being named is not the absence. Sometimes it's a system as failing to recognize the architecture in front of it, right? And I think about this in terms of like automotive stuff. I have a set of wrenches, spanners, sockets, whatnot, and they're all in imperial measure. But I have a Japanese car. And so are my tools delayed, defective, right, in need of remediation? Or do I just need to get metric tools, right? I just need the proper tool for the job. And so what I'm telling these people is that they haven't put a valid instrument in front of the child in many, many cases. And so if we want to do right by these children, these likely autistic children, likely Gestalt processors, then the task is not to force them into a single developmental sequence, and the only one we know how to measure with these instruments that we're given. Our task is to become more precise, more plural, more accountable to the forms of coherence that we're not trained to see, right? And I think about that in conversations I've had this week about my evolution of language. And No Place for Autism was written with scripts and language that I received from my own psychology journal and journey around, my autism diagnosis on the journey from DSM-4 to DSM-5. And then seeing things clinically and classrooms and realizing there's a different architecture and that my language is not right, that I was given non-verbal by the system for me and for many of the people around me, but that's not entirely the case. I have a rich, kind of meaningful script library here, so it's very verbal and vocal different and stuff, and so that kind of set me down the road in finding gestalt and the framework of natural language acquisition and so on that shows up the next year in the next book. And so I want to I want to point out to this particular group of people that what they're calling delay might be a category error, right? That some of our language is being misread by these frameworks that they're meant to assess us. And so that's what I've been up to this week. And since I'm choosing the topic, um, I figured I would go with that. Hopefully, I haven't gone too long. But again, I don't have Cathy here and the squirrel to tell me it's time to close. But I think I've hit a good point. I do look forward in the next weeks to getting together with Cathy and putting these together. But with the holiday weekend, it's just not in the cards. So I thank you very much for your time and bid you a very good weekend and a good week ahead. Bye bye.